Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our midweek study. Very nice that we can all gather together in the middle of our week to come around the Word of God and to study a section of it, and obviously to enjoy some company tonight with that common faith that we all enjoy.
Having enormous
You can hear the radio, I think.
becoming our top-selling vehicles on our road.
Now, just before we start, there is a handout, so hopefully everyone's got 2 pages. I believe it's 2 pages. Yep.
There are warnings
If not, I think there was someone at the back might be able to help. And tonight,
also received a future 4th round pick.
dear God in heaven above, we come to you at the beginning of our evening together. We praise your great and holy name, knowing that you are the only true God that does exist, the creator of all things.
Hello, Natasha.
We're very thankful that we're able to come together tonight to share time together around your word, looking particularly at the prophecy of Zechariah. for those that have all just come in. I think there was a bit of a traffic jam up the road, so very nice to have you all here with us as well. So Mike Russing Italian is going to read for us Zechariah chapter 1 as an intro for our evening together.
Good evening, everyone. Ooh. Was that the radio we had going on there for a little bit? It's nice. All right, I'm hoping, that sounds a little bit loud to me, but maybe not to everyone else. I'm hoping everyone's got the two little handouts. We're going to come back to those handouts, which are little charts I've put together, and they will also be on the screen at certain points during this evening in our sessions on Zechariah. Well, brothers and sisters, Zechariah is an amazing book. And our objective for the sessions that we have here at Bible class at Brighton is going to be to try and dig into this book and come to grips with what it really is all about. I'm going to have to say I chose this precisely because Zechariah remains, or has remained up until around now, a mystery to me. I've got lots of marking in it from when I was a teenager about this, that, and the other, but I've never had a coherent idea of what this prophet really was about. I knew his times, and we're briefly going to make sure we're on the same page with that, but I've never felt like I've captured the message of Zechariah as a whole. And so our objective over the next little while is to try and do that as an ecclesia and see what it has to say to us as brothers and sisters and young people here at Brighton. And there is, when we dig into Zechariah, brothers and sisters, and we go through this, the messages are really powerful in Zechariah. We see it over and over again. And I think, and we'll see, it's really relevant today. Zechariah is ancient. This is at the time when the exiles have returned. There's so many things about their circumstances that are entirely different to ours. Completely different circumstances. A different covenant, a different kind of ritual and center and method of worship. Everything's different. And yet, Zechariah was there for a deeply profound purpose, to renew spiritual worship in the people. And we're going to see that as we go through. And the messages that he has for them are relevant for us. There's things in Zechariah that address laziness and apathy. There's messages in Zechariah that address being disillusioned with the truth, and that even address dealing with gripes or complaints. And it's a wake-up call as we go through Zechariah to every generation. And as we go through it, we'll find, too, that it's serious. There's serious things said that are like, whoa, like how do you deal with that when he talks about some of the shepherds and what's going to happen to the sheep, and one of the shepherds even eats the sheep in Zechariah later on. It was like, what is going on there? But it's really serious. But at the end, and as we go through, Zechariah is fully kind of threaded with encouraging messages for the people of the time. And we saw that in chapter 1. It starts off, as we'll see a little bit later, with a call to repentance. That's the whole start of the prophecy. But we get partway through chapter 1, and God is saying, I'm coming. I am coming to Jerusalem with mercy. That's his covenant love, the Kesed. He's coming with mercy to Jerusalem. So this is a God, as Zechariah portrays him, perhaps more than any other minor prophet, a God that is exceedingly passionate. Well, let's catch the fire. Let's give it a little taste of this. We're jumping in. Who knows where Zechariah 8 fits in? Doesn't matter. Let's just catch the passion. Come to Zechariah 8. This is how God feels. We've already seen it in chapter 1, that he's desiring to return to Jerusalem and restore Jerusalem. But check this out. Chapter 8, verse 1. Again, the word of Yahweh of hosts came, saying, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I am zealous, or the Hebrew can be jealous. I am zealous for Zion with great zeal. With great fervor, I am zealous for her. Now if you feel that, this is a God who has made promises, who's chosen this area, who's watched his people get destroyed and beaten out of this area for 70 years. Now they've returned, and God is showing them through Zechariah that he is intensely, and that's an understatement, intensely passionate about the fate of Jerusalem and the people that are in that city. So that's the prophet that we have to look at in our Bible classes over the next little while together. Now, To get a hold of Zechariah, we're going to do a few things tonight. This is what we're going to do. We're going to look at the context. I don't want to go into dates of Persian kings, blah. Like, not interested, and it never sticks with anyone anyway. I'm just going to give you the basic fundamental dates. If they're off by 3 or 4 years, I'm not really concerned. The idea you will get very clearly. We are given dates in Zechariah, so we're going to go with those dates. And we're going to use the ones in the level of detail that is relevant to the message of Zechariah. But we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at Cambyses and what happened to him and whatever. So we're going to look at the context. We're then going to look at, as we go through, we're going to look at the main people. There's leaders, there's prophets, and there's angels in this prophecy. And we need to know who they are and what they're up to in the prophecy. And I found, for me, that's super helpful. So we're going to look at context. We're going to look at the main people. We're going to look at the main parts of Zechariah tonight, overview, what's going on, and we're going to look at the purpose. So that's where we're going. And hopefully tonight, this will give you a framework. So the objective tonight is to head into the later chapters of Zechariah with a little bit of a roadmap, because Zechariah is so confusing if you don't have that. Like, literally, what is going on? Like, even in chapter 1, we're already, wait, what is going on? So that's our objective. We want to sort of understand it. So let's do our little bit of context that the Bible gives us. First of all, to come to Zechariah, we need 3 books of the Bible. We need Zechariah, we need Ezra 1-6, and we need Haggai. So whenever you look at the book of Zechariah, and as we do, we'll keep coming back to Ezra 1-6, deals with this time, this book, and Haggai. And we'll see how that works, right? Those are the 3 things that we're going to be going between, mainly Zechariah and Ezra 1-6. So the people, where we're up to is the people have come through 70 years of captivity. So there's been 70 years have elapsed since when they were taken captive by the Babylonians and when they've actually returned. Now, if you're Zechariah, Haggai, any of the other characters, you know that 70 years has ticked over, right? And it's time to get working. However, and we'll look at this a little bit later in one of our next sessions, there's another 70-year time period that relates to the captivity. So there's 70 years from the captivity to starting to when they're allowed to go back, but there's another 70-year measurement. Does anyone know where it starts and where it finishes? Yeah, so Chronicles, we're not going to look at this now, but Chronicles also measures this from the destruction of the temple. There's 70 years to the rebuilding of the temple, right? So the first 70 years timeline has already elapsed. From captivity to return, 70 years. But they're probably 50 years into the 70 years from destruction of temple to rebuilding the temple. So we're really close to the rebuilding of the temple, and that's what Zechariah is trying to fire the people up to do and to get onto. 70 years from the destruction of the temple to the rebuilding. Precisely. Amazing. All right? Now, while they were gone for 70 years, things happened in the land. And we know what happened in the land. This is just the map of the empire under this time. This was founded by Cyrus, the Persian Empire. Now this is under Darius I, who his empire was the greatest, or the Persian Empire was greatest under him. But something happened to the land of Israel, Judah and Benjamin in particular, while they were gone. Does anyone know? Who moved in? The Samaritans, okay? So 100 years before this time, the king of Assyria demolished Babylon and took people from Babylon, because Babylon was just a city. It was a pretty nice city. In fact, it was known as the holy city of the pagan Western Empire, okay, or Western Asia. So he takes captives from Babylon, this is 2 Kings 17, and he takes those captives and settles them. They're from Babylon. He puts them in Samaria. This is 100 years before Zechariah's time. And they live there. Are they Jewish? No, they're not. What religion are they? Babylonian. Did they bring their own gods to that land? Yes, they brought all their own gods. It's all documented in 2 Kings 17. So during the 70 years of captivity, those Samaritans end up migrating into the land of Judah and Benjamin. So when the exiles come back, the land is not empty. There's these foreigners there. people that are hostile to them, known as Samaritans, and they're not from Samaria, they are from Babylon. Now, this is an absolute key to Zechariah and understanding what Zechariah is onto, right? Just log that away, that Zechariah is dealing with a time when the people have come back and there's Babylonians in the area of Samaria and Judah and Benjamin, right? They're there. So this is what they're coming back to. This is what they find. So when Cyrus makes his decree in 538 BC, Zerubbabel and Joshua and the first wave of exiles come back. And this is what they come back to. Their land, the temple's in smoking, destroyed. Well, it's not smoking anymore. It's been a while, 50 years. It's destroyed. There's a pile of rubbish. And the exiles come back. And not only is there a pile of rubbish, there's these Samaritans that have Babylonian roots. And they're giving them trouble, right? Does anyone know how many exiles come back in the first return? Joshua and Zerubbabel is the first wave. They're the leaders. Ezra 1 tells us, let's go flip back to Ezra chapter 1. We're setting the context tonight, and we've got to have it really strong in our mind, I believe. So come to Ezra chapter 1. This is the decree of Cyrus that we know. Captivity, 70 years of captivity is up. You can go back to your land. Verse 1. Ezra 1, now the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, and made a proclamation. People can go back. So who comes back? Well, come to chapter 2. These are the people of the province who came back from captivity, of those who had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone to his own city. Who are they? Well, we've got a list, right? But look at verse 2. Those who came with Zerubbabel, so he's the leader. Zerubbabel is a governor. He's connected to the line of David. We'll see that. But he's not a king, he's a governor. Because you can't be a king, like they're in Persia. You can't be a king in Persia, you're just a governor. So it's Zerubbabel, and you've got Jeshua or Joshua is there too. The Nehemiah that's mentioned there is not the Nehemiah that you find later on. So this is the first wave. Zechariah is dealing with Joshua and Zerubbabel. Joshua is the high priest, and Zerubbabel the governor. This is the first wave who come back to the land, right? Now, Ezra is not for another 60 years down the track, and Nehemiah, 80 years down the track. So this is the first wave. Joshua and Zerubbabel come with 50,000, about 50,000, we're told in Ezra, 50,000 people, right? It's not that many actually. They come back, do stuff. 60 years later, Ezra comes back with another wave of Levites and other people. 20 years after that, Nehemiah goes back and finds the city walls still in ruins. Does that make sense? So just so we're really clear on those waves that are coming back. We're in the first wave early on. This is Joshua and Zerubbabel. Now, what do they do when they come back? Let's come to chapter 3. So Joshua and Zerubbabel, Joshua's the high priest, Zerubbabel's the governor, they drive the initial restoration. Look what it says in chapter 3, verse 1. And when the 7th month had come and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. So good, they're back. Nothing's there yet, really, but look at verse 2. Then Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren the priests, so he's a priest, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren arose and built the altar. So the context of this is the first thing that these exiles do is build the altar. And then they do a kind of a form of the Feast of Tabernacles and offer to God. What's the next thing they build in chapter 3? Scan down. What do you see that they build next? The foundation of the temple. Where's that, Uncle Aaron? Verse 10. Look at this. So they do, just scooch back to verse 8. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year, so that's after their return, they've been back for about 2 years, it says Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of their brethren, the priests and Levites, verse 8, they come together, and like Uncle Aaron said, the next thing they build is the foundation slab for the temple, right? Look at, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple for the Lord, the priests stood up in their apparel with trumpets, and Levites and sons of Asaph and cymbals, and praised Yahweh according to the ordinance of David, the king of Israel. So this is cool. There's two things rebuilt, right? And this is what we've put on the little timeline. In the top, this is busy, but this is how I have had to put this together, because there's so many things going on with Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah. But I hope this is a really useful reference to you. On the left, we saw Cyrus's decree. So Zerubbabel and Joshua go back. They build the altar in about 538, 537. And then about 2 years later, they build the foundations of the temple slab, right? Concreting whatever they're doing. All the tradies were out doing their thing. And other people were helping out too. So that is what happens. But if you look, there's a massive gap. And the gap is really the story of Zechariah. Because all of that fervor and joy comes to a screeching halt. Because the Samaritans and other people in their land are really worried about what the Jews are doing coming back. And they try everything they can do to stop the Jews. Right? Come back to Ezra. And we know this story, so we're just kind of skating over it to create the context. Look at verse 1 of chapter 4. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of Yahweh, God of Israel, they did something about it. And they try all sorts of means to kind of cause fear and all this kind of stuff. And this actually ends up leaving the people with so much fear that they actually stop the work, right? So what we've got after the temple foundation is laid, they start building, I think they started building the temple, maybe some of the initial like little brickworks, and then they all stopped because they're afraid. There's serious opposition, right? The adversaries are real. And this requires for Joshua and Zerubbabel courage to keep going. I mean, think about the context. This is all Zechariah. Think about the context. The people are back. They've got nothing. There's like, Cyrus said, I'll help you. I'll give you anything you want, right, to rebuild, so go for it. So they're back there, but they've got nothing really to go on, and there's nothing really happening, and they've got to do really hard work to build this stuff. And it was hard work, right? They didn't have, all the modern machinery, so it's pretty full on. And now, think about this, and why would God do this? Just think about this, brothers and sisters. Why would God make it so when they came back, it was hard? Weird. Like they've just been in captivity for 70 years. God says, you can go back. They go back, and it's hard. There's people there that are trying to stop them, and all sorts of other problems that we'll look at a little bit later. Why would God do that? What do you actually think? Why wouldn't he just make it smooth sailing? Like if he really wants a temple, just make it easy. They've been in captivity for 70 years. Yeah. Right? What have they been doing for the last 70 years? Just hanging out in captivity, right? Yeah, so this is the weird thing, but it's true in Scripture, and we find this over and over again, that God asks us to do things and then puts obstacles in the way to get there. And it's not to trip us up, it's to actually test whether we are going to rely on us or him completely. And those come in little teeny challenges along the way and lots of big ones along the way sometimes too. But the whole point of that is, yes, I'm with you, I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to do the work in the end, but the strength you're going to have to get through this is not going to come from your own self. And he puts challenges in there to test if they really want to do this or if they're just coming out because they have other motives to do so. It turns out that they're too afraid and they stop for maybe 10 to 15 years. There's fear. We learn from other places that there's apathy. And do you know what's really interesting? As a result of this, I put it in a little gray line. This is something I didn't quite know before. But as soon as they do that, God sends them drought. Did you know that? Come to Haggai chapter 2. Haggai is the same time. Everything was going strong, and then the drought hits. The drought hits because they stopped. Look at this. Haggai chapter 1 is right in this area. He speaks after this long gap of people not doing anything. Haggai chapter 1, look at this. He tells the people, verse 9, look what happened to them. He's telling the people, you looked for much, but indeed it came to little. When you brought it home, I blew it away. So whenever you had anything to bring home, I destroyed it with like maybe disease or drought or whatever it was, says the Lord of hosts. Because my house that is in ruins, every one of you runs to his own house. Look at verse 10. Therefore the heavens above you withhold the dew, and the earth withholds its fruit. So Haggai is talking in a time where they've gone through a period of drought during this whole time. Now he refers to it again, just look over it in chapter 2, right? Verse 15, telling the people that have been not doing anything for so long. Look at verse 15. Now carefully consider from this day forward, from before the stone was laid upon stone in the temple of Yahweh, since those days when one came to heap up 20 ephahs, but there were 10, when one came to the wine vat to draw out 50 baths from the press, but there were only 20, I struck you with blight and mildew and hail and all the labor of your hands. Yet you did not turn to me, says Yahweh. Consider now from this day forward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, which is right now when he's speaking, from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it. So he's saying, from the time that the temple was laid, and then you stopped building, from then you have suffered a time of drought. Now, put yourself in the position of the people. Yes, this came about because they were lazy in their approach to the truth and their approach to God's house and each other. But now they've got opposition from Samaritans, fear, like serious trying to thwart their efforts. And they're also dealing with issues like drought. And also Zechariah alludes to this fact that actually people were getting pretty angsty with each other. Well, let me show you. Zechariah chapter 8. Flick over to Zechariah. Zechariah refers to this period of drought as well, which is the gray band down there. I just want you to know what's happening to the people so we can enter into it. Look at Zechariah 8, verse 9. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, let your hands be strong. So he's talking directly to the people. Let your hands be strong. You who have been hearing in these days the words by the mouth of the prophets, who spoke in the day the foundation was laid. So his prophets were saying, go and build, and they did, but then they stopped. For the house of Yahweh of hosts, that the temple might be built. For before these days there was no wages for man, nor any hire for beast. There was no peace for the enemy, for whoever went out or came in. For I set all men against everyone, or everyone against his neighbor. So Zechariah alludes to this idea that since they stopped building, and in these days, or up until now when he's speaking, they've been through a period of drought, disease, pestilence, and unrest. It's not easy, and it's not nice. And all of that came because they stopped building. And the prophets and Moses said exactly that would happen. If you don't obey me, you don't follow me, the rain's going to be withheld. That's harsh. This is not an easy time. So before we enter into this idea that, like, wow, the people are really slack and lazy, well, that is true, and Haggai and Zechariah can tell you that. And they had other problems too that we'll look at through this series, which is a really amazing and helpful for us to think about. But it was a tough place to live. And so when Zechariah and Haggai come along, he's trying to renew their faithfulness, and so that those blessings can return to them, including rain. Pretty amazing. That's what they had to go through. So they come back after 70 years, they fall into apathy, and they've got a lot of trouble. So I don't want you to think that the times are okay except for the building of the temple. It's tough. And here the foundation is literally sitting there, and it's probably growing over with weeds. And I think about that. As a normal brother and sister or person in Israel, you would see the foundations. Everyone knew where it was. The foundation has not been touched for 15 years. It's got weeds growing over it. And every time you go to work or you go out to your field or maybe through that part of the city, you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, like 15 years ago I was helping lay in the concrete for that. Why not anymore? Well, like, what got into them? They're afraid, so they stopped, but then other little excuses started coming in. And we'll see some of those as we unpack. Little justifications for not rebuilding and not really getting involved in ecclesial life. And they were insidious and they grew. So that's the context. Captivity, they're back, and this is what it feels like to be in that time. Now, when we look at Zechariah, if that's the context, I want to show you who the main people are. Now, before I do this, I'm going to show you that I'm going to give you an idea of, is that we're going to go through the leaders, and I'm going to go through the prophets, and then I'm going to talk about the angels involved. So let's start with the leaders. These are all relevant to Zechariah. I love it because Zechariah has characters. There's a lot of people to understand who's who and what's going on. So let's get into it. There they are. Now, little comment about the drawing. I have had the great pleasure for the last 3 months, maybe 4 now, of working with, so when I started looking at Zechariah about a year ago, I'm like, I don't even understand what these pictures are in Revelation, in Zechariah, because there's all these wacky things going on, like lady with stork wings and everything else we'll look at, which is amazing. But I tried to find some pictures of these, if anyone's done it, and I found some, but they're very old and slightly crusty. So I went to Adrian Petit, who's our art teacher, and I said, Adrian, like, we've got to draw. You have to draw. You have to draw all of the characters and the night visions in Zechariah, because it's never really been done. I don't know. Well, like, there's some sketches, and we'll show them another time. But I don't feel like it's done really clearly and simply. So he agreed. So over the last 3 or 4 months, we've been working on it, and we sketched out a plan of all the diagrams and whatever, and he's been going back and forth with it, and awesome. So these are his drawings, and he's going to make them available to anyone for Zechariah stuff in the future. So here we are. Meet the characters. Joshua the high priest, there he is. He's not wearing his high priest clothes, right? He doesn't always wear those. That's when he's doing his service, but he's got normal civvies as well that he just wears, right? And you see his civvies get really dirty because he's helping. Anyway, that's Joshua the high priest, which is great. He's also known as Jeshua, and I'm just going to make it bigger so I don't have to turn around. He's from the priestly line, and he is first back under Cyrus, as we've already learned. So I just want you to look at those guys. I know they're not real pictures, but just have a little respect for these two leaders. They were leaders truly. They were faithful men that led 50,000 people back when the call first came up. Now there's heaps more than that that never got out of Babylon. And 60 years later, when Ezra says, let's go, there's almost nobody responds relative to the number who could. Like the Levites, pathetic. They don't get up and go. So these two brothers, Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel, they must have been good mates, and they knew what was going on. Now there's more to this, because if you're going to fire up a restoration, you can't just have a governor, and you can't just have a priest. So I'm convinced this is probably what happened, right? Joshua the high priest is really passionate. He's like, yes, Cyrus made his decree, I'm going to go back. Zerubbabel's like, yeah, I'm going to go back too. Good. Now we've got a priest, Aaronic line, and we've got someone from the Davidic line. Now that, we might think, yeah, nice. That is crucially important to establishing anything proper back in the land of Israel. You've got to have the Davidic line there, and you've got to have the Aaronic line. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And that is stipulated by David and really articulated later by Ezra when he writes Chronicles. Super important. So these are the first back. Really amazing examples. Despite the fear, despite the travel distance, like look how far they had to travel, right? However they got back, they just troops back. Cyrus was with them, he helped them, but still, that's a big call to go back to nothing. And you've probably heard rumors of the Samaritans back there. So there's our two leaders, and we're going to hear a lot about them. They are mentioned in Zechariah's prophecy. That's why they're here. Zechariah explicitly talks about Joshua twice. In fact, Joshua appears in one of his visions. Like in the night, when he wakes up, the angel, he sees a picture of Joshua, the high priest. He's got dirty clothes on, but we'll talk about that later. He also mentions Zerubbabel in Zechariah chapter 4. So these two guys are not just characters at the time. They come right into the prophecy and message of Zechariah. It's fantastic, but we'll look at that a little bit later. So that's our two leaders. Now, our prophets, here we are, they're on your page, Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai is not mentioned by name in Zechariah, but you should know based on your chart that these guys are totally on the same page. In fact, it's like Haggai prophesies, Zechariah prophesies, they're all in together. So let's just scooch forward and I'll show you that. Look at this, right? I put these together because it's worth noting, worth bookmarking in. Zechariah is the green up there, and he's got 3 sections of his book that are dated, 8th month, 11th month, and of the second year of Darius. Well, Haggai is prophesying exactly at the same time, within months. So Haggai starts 2 months before Zechariah. He starts, they rebuild the temple, right? And then he gives another prophecy in Haggai chapter 2, and that's where Zechariah just bursts onto the scene with another call to repentance, because people are sort of dropping off, maybe, at that time. You'll see possibly why. So these two prophets are good friends. They're on the same page, just like Joshua and Zerubbabel, and they are passionate about resurrecting the faith and the passion of the people. Zechariah is from a line of priests and prophets, and you can trace that if you go back. We'll have a little bit more of a look at that in a minute. But pretty amazing. Now, you notice something about how I got Adrian to draw them, right? Haggai is clearly an old guy. And Zechariah is not. And this is something I never knew until I was looking at that, but that is historically accurate, I think. Anyway, we'll see as we go. Let's have a look at them. Just before we do, actually, I just want to show you something about when Zechariah starts, okay? So, let's go back up here. Just think about this. This is the second year of Darius. Maybe 15 years have gone by. Haggai bursts onto the scene and says, consider your ways. Like, start building, guys. So, they do. Joshua and Zerubbabel was like, this is just what we need. And they get all fired up. It actually says that. Like, the spirit of Zerubbabel and Joshua was totally stirred up. And they start building. Look at this. Zerubbabel and Joshua rose up and built again. Ezra records it. So does Haggai. Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and Joshua and all the remnant of the people because of Haggai. So they do it. But right at that time, there's Persian opposition. And the Persians smell a rat. They see the temple being rebuilt. And they get out Tatnai. I'd never even know that he was in there before. But anyway, Tatnai is in there. And he writes a letter to Darius. And he's like, dear Darius, right? We know the Jews are rebuilding the temple again. I don't think this is really cool. And he sends it off to Darius. And Darius gets the message. And Darius is like, let me check. And he's like, I think there's a scroll somewhere. I'm summarizing this, but it's all in Ezra, chapter 6. I think there's a scroll somewhere that says the Jews are allowed to do this. I think Cyrus said that. So Darius, okay, we got to look at it. Come to Ezra chapter 6. I love this. This is amazing. The baddies write a letter and say, wait a second. And they ask the big guy, the big cheese, is this all good? And Darius actually isn't quite sure, it seems. Come to Ezra chapter 6. They write him a letter. Let's go 5 or 17. Now therefore, if it seems good, Ezra 5:17, to the king, this is Tatnai and these other guys, Persians, let a search be made in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, whither it is so that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. So it's just like a little bit of a passive aggression. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm just going to check and see if this is okay. So Darius says in verse 1, King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. Note that. And at Achametha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found. And in it was a record of Cyrus's decree. And he's like, oh yeah, this is true. They're allowed to. So he writes back to the Persian baddies, and he says, yeah, it's all good. And actually now you have to help them. So this is really cool. I think Zechariah starts his prophecy precisely because if you were a person in Israel, you've just started rebuilding, and you now know that the Persians are at you. And they're writing to Darius, and you're just waiting to see, is Darius going to let you? Going to green light or red light? So I believe right when they're probably waiting, because it probably took Darius a little while to get the scroll and find it. Do you agree? Probably, like he didn't do that the next day. Probably sent a decree, wrote it, someone had to search the archives, send it back on horse, whatever. So I believe Zechariah starts precisely because the Persians wrote a letter saying, I don't know if this is right. And Zechariah jumps on the scene to back Haggai up and say, yes, return to God, keep going, he's going to be with you. And as we read in chapter 1, one of the opening lines is, I'm returning to Jerusalem with mercies. Don't stop. Don't worry about what the Persian guys are doing in their letter and what's going to happen as a result. Go for it. Do not get discouraged. So there's every reason to be discouraged at a time like this. And Haggai and Zechariah are tag teaming it by the Spirit of God to get them going. You know, there's something else really amazing about what's going on with Zechariah and Haggai. Right? Come to Zechariah 1, verse 1. Let's just get a little bit of an idea of who Zechariah is and just capture what's happening. Look at Zechariah. His name is mentioned, obviously, first in verse 1. The word of Yahweh came to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying. So Zechariah means Yahweh has remembered, and he's the son of Berechiah, which means Yah has blessed. And he's the son of Iddo, which literally means at the appointed time. Now, I'm not one for stretchy kind of conjectures, but this is definite in my mind. You wouldn't list all these names unless there's something going on, and they're really powerful names, right? Yahweh's remembered. He's going to bless, but he's going to bless at the appointed time, a very specific time. What time do you think that's going to be? What time period are they waiting for? The 70 years from the destruction to the establishment of the temple. When was the temple finally built on your little chart? What year at the end of the chart? 516, and it was built. And that, I'm going to suggest to you, is the appointed time. And Zechariah's whole prophecy, based on his name, his dad's name, and his grandpa's name, is going to be encouraging the people for the next 20 years to get to 516 BC when the temple, at the very appointed time, 70 years exactly, is going to be established. It's awesome. But there's more, okay? If we're told this about Zechariah, right, we are told in Nehemiah 12 that he was a priest and he came with Joshua and Zerubbabel. We know that. That's in Ezra as well. But look what... if this is the case, we're also told, I want you to come to Nehemiah chapter 12. Sorry, that was about Iddo the prophet. You know how sometimes we get listed names and we're kind of wondering what on earth we have them for at times? There's so many reasons, but here's a little nugget that's captured in Nehemiah to give you a little bit of info about Iddo, because it's going to paint a picture. Nehemiah chapter 12, what do we know about Iddo? Well, verse 4, this is definitely the Iddo that we're talking about, because it's the time of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, verse 1. Iddo, as we follow through, is connected to the priests and the Levites. See that in verse 6 and 7? Iddo is connected to the priests and Levites, so he's a priest. And we're told he came with Joshua and Zerubbabel. Now, Iddo is the grandfather of Zechariah. But he's one of the guys that came back with Joshua and Zerubbabel. So he's probably pretty old. Do you agree? Iddo's coming back as an old man. And he was probably around and saw the destruction of the first temple, which is maybe 50, 60 years before. Yeah? He came back and he's the grandfather of Zechariah, so he's got to be an older guy. Does that make sense? So when we look at this, that tells us something really clearly about Zechariah, and that is he is a younger guy. He's not an old man. His grandfather is coming out with the exiles. So he's there as the grandson of Iddo, and he's taking up the mantle of priest/prophet. Does that make sense? Really clear. So they're all connected. And Zechariah is clearly a young man. So how do we know that Haggai's old? Any ideas? Does anyone know the clues that might suggest Haggai's pretty old? This is how... It's not definitive. I'm fairly convinced.
He promised people to remember what the temple would look like in chapter 2.
Of Haggai. Yeah, this is so cool. Sam loves this too, so Sam's on fire. Come to Haggai chapter 2. Look at this. Haggai speaking, verse 3. Listen to this. Now, imagine, who can say this? A young guy or an older, experienced brother? Verse 3. Haggai says, "Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? In comparison with it, is this not in your eyes as nothing?" Okay, so here's another problem that's going on. There's a bunch of people, the older generation, that saw the first temple and think this new temple that they're starting to build is rubbish. Like, that's what that means. This is not even nearly good enough and up to our expectations. This is not how it was when we were kids running around the temple before Nebuchadnezzar sacked it. This is not as holy, it's not as precious, it's not as lovely, it's not as big, not as awesome. And there's people at this time, and you can read it in Ezra, the older generation started crying when they laid the foundation of the temple. Ezra chapter 3. At the end of everyone's like, yes, we've laid the foundation of the temple. And the older generation, this is total trash. Like, what are we thinking? There's not the fanciness, not the largeness, nothing. They were really down on it, and down on the work, down on everything. And Haggai addresses this here. Now, Haggai cannot be a young brother addressing an older generation saying, who among you saw that? And is this not as nothing in your eyes? This is the idea, and it's almost certain, that Haggai saw it too. He would have been an experienced person. He knew what they were feeling, but he's countering that to the people. And that's why he can say to them as an older brother, consider your ways. This is serious stuff. You cannot have this attitude, right? There's a new generation coming up. They have the right spirit. They need to be pushed on. They need to encourage, not to be encouraged, not discouraged. So Haggai, it seems, is an older brother who witnessed the former glory of the temple, him and his peers, and he's addressing that. Now, that's really interesting, right? Because when you come back to Ezra chapter 3, and you'll see what this older generation did. We alluded to it. They laid the foundation, and look what it says. Verse 12. Everyone's happy, but, verse 12, Ezra 3, many of the priests and the Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of the temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy. So this is what we've got in Ezra's time. Haggai. Well, not Ezra, but this time. Haggai and Joshua and Zerubbabel. The older people are crying because they're not happy and they're not satisfied. And using words like rubbish and all that is exactly what the Hebrew's getting at. In fact, Zechariah alludes to this too, and he says the people of this day were calling it the day of small stuff. Tiddlywinks. That's not the literal Hebrew, but that's the idea. So there's people that think this is lame, and they were crying back at the time, and Haggai says this is as nothing to you, right? So think about this, brothers and sisters. Think of the genius of how God is firing these people up. He's got 2 prophets, right? One old and one young. Why is that super, super important for this time and this context? Experience and enthusiasm. Yes? 100%. Haggai can talk to the older generation and help them and counsel them to consider their ways in a way that a young man maybe not. The principle of Timothy, young men are not to rebuke older women, but treat them as a father, right? But the young people are there to show that, no, there's a new spirit, there's new enthusiasm. Not everything's going to look the same. It's not going to turn out all the same, but the same passion for God is there. Things will change, but we have to check the teaching, check the motivation, and check the spirit. And that's the core. What it looks like is not the issue. What's really at the core is the issue. And the spirit in Zechariah's time is this. There's multiple problems going on. And one of the layers is this older generation is down on the younger generation of what's going on. That cannot happen, brothers and sisters. And nor can the younger generation not care what the older generation thinks. But God's opinion is this. This temple's beautiful. I want you to make it. Don't worry about the old one. This is a new day, a new generation, and I will be sanctified in this place. I'm returning to Jerusalem, whether it's an old temple or not. Sorry, whether it's a new temple or not. Small, tiddlywink one or not. Doesn't matter. He's actually interested about the hearts of the people. And the older generation forgot that. That is all in Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah, and they all come back to that. That's really, really powerful. These are good calls to us. You know, Ecclesiastes 7 verse 10 says, don't ask in your heart, why were the former days better than these? It's interesting, isn't it? Don't ask in your heart, Ecclesiastes 7:10, why were the former days better than these? And do you know what the answer is? Like the reason? Does anyone know the follow-on? This is all the wise person says. Because you don't ask wisely concerning this. He doesn't take a side and say, yeah, they probably were, they probably weren't. He just says that is not a wise thing to do. We cannot go about today's work consistently trying to compare it to a generation ago. We can take cues, we can take good things, but we cannot be down on current things by always thinking that it was better in the past. Because the reality, Ecclesiastes says, is scriptural wisdom. Reality is, it probably wasn't. We can look back at the past with rose-colored glasses. And who cares anyway? The point is, Zechariah and Haggai are all about, we need to get into the work today and add enthusiasm. And if you're standing off, down on other people, or not involved, whether you're young or old, you are not going to contribute to the work of God that he's trying to stir up in his people. Then, today, and however much time we have left before Christ returns. It's so important. And this is what the whole prophecy of Zechariah is trying to do. He's a young man, he's being used by God, and he's stirring up a new generation to get them out of their chairs, young and old, to serve. Pretty amazing. This is what God is trying to do. Now, that is our leaders, and that's our prophets. So you know where Zechariah fits in with Haggai. Here's a little quote from Uncle John Carter. It's no good to live in the past when work calls for attention, when some things that may be lacking can be supplied by zealous labor. That's the point. Nothing's ever going to get accomplished by looking at the past and saying it was better. It's time to get work now and get involved and get into it. Beautiful. Now, 2 leaders, 2 prophets, 2 angels. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of Zechariah, and we're only going to touch on it tonight because we're pretty much out of time. But what I'm going to do next week is show you how the angels figure in here. We've looked at the leaders, Joshua's rebel, and their passion and their need to be encouraged again. We looked at the 2 prophets, but there's 2 angels that are particularly prevalent in the first half of Zechariah. The first one is not called the presiding angel. I'll show you what he's called. I just put it there because it's what some people call him. But look at this. Come to Zechariah chapter 1. We read about him. Zechariah chapter 1. We're given the date in verse 7. Look at verse 8. I saw by night, so this is a night vision, and behold, a man riding on a red horse, and it stood among the myrtle trees. In the New King James, by the way, I'm reading, I think it's a bit clearer. It says, he stood among the myrtle trees in a hollow. The idea is this like basin area, like a little hollow grove of myrtle trees. There's a man on a red horse, and behind him were horses red, sorrel, which is a browny color, and white. Okay? Then I said, my Lord, what are these? And here's our angel. The angel who talked with me said to me, I will show you what they are. That's this guy right here. All the way through the first 6 chapters of Zechariah, this angel walks Zechariah through these visions he has in the night. We're going to call him the presiding angel. He's the angel that talked with me. But there's another angel here. And I think what we'll do is kind of pick him apart next week, or next class, as we jump into the first major section of the book of Zechariah, which is going to be the night visions. So what we'll do in our next class, because there's no point in pushing it, we don't need to. So in the next class, we'll look at the angels. We're going to start looking at the night visions. But before we do that, we're going to look at the whole structure of the book. So we've looked at the context and the time. I want to show you how the book works, because it's going to be super important as we jump in, see how that angel fits in, and see how that angel fits in. Super exciting. And we'll pick it up next week with the two angels. Good.
Thank you very much for your work. Obviously, a lot of months of work leading up to tonight. So I have now some announcements by our brother Andrew.
In September 2023, Ms. Milgate is defending herself in the Darwin local court and says the case has taken a personal and financial toll. Ms. Fowles described the incident as an act of violence that caused discomfort and changed the way politicians engage with the community.
We've got a few things on for the rest of the week, God willing. Tomorrow night at Hyde Park at 7:45 is again the combined singing and orchestra practice for the combined
Behavioural
weekend.
expert says
And the
while
combined weekend
demand-based
begins
pricing is a
on
widely
Friday
used
the
approach,
18th with a
issues
combined
arise when prices change
Southern
between
and
the
Northern Youth
selection
Group
and
at 8
checkout
p.m. up at
process.
Cornerstones.
Ticketmaster is under
And a
fire
very
for engaging
interesting
in the
topic, the
tactic.
great toes
Federal
of
government has
Adonai Bezek.
accused or announced rather a crackdown
quite
on the
sure
practice of dynamic
what thrust
pricing
of that is,
and
but
also
maybe
plans
go
to
along and
investigate
find out.
hidden fees and drip
Brother
pricing
Nathan
where
Lewis
extra costs
and
are
parents
added
have
at
been asked
checkout.
to pick up their
Dr. Meg
children by
Elkins
10
from
p.m.
RMIT
please.
says a
And
lack
just
of
a reminder,
competition is a
there's
driving factor.
What
a couple
happens
of
is
posts
you've got
required
one
from
price that you
Bryson.
know that you're
So
going
if
to
you're
pay,
available to
and
do
as
that,
you're going
can you
through the
please
process,
head along?
the tickets can go up.
And the
There's
combined
nothing there
weekends,
stopping it at the
on
moment.
Saturday
The biggest concern is
continues
that there's one major ticket
with
provider, and that's
the
Live Nation
food
or
preparation at
Ticketmaster.
Cumberland
So
at 10
some level of monopoly
a.m.
power is
for those
driving
who
this.
might be able to
Hundreds
help
of mysterious
with
black
potatoes
balls that washed
and
up on three eastern
onions, I
Sydney
think.
beaches have been identified
And
as
then
tar
study
balls.
one at
Sandy
5 p.m. in
Gregory
the
is
afternoon.
The golf ball
topic on
size
that occasion
objects
too
which washed up
fast.
in the
Dinner will be
thousands on
provided,
Coogee and
and
Gordons Bay
at
beaches have
7:30
been
the
tested.
second
Randwick
study
Council
to
says
Fickle.
preliminary results show they're a
The combined weekend
hydrocarbon-based pollutant.
continues
Key
on
components
Sunday
of
with a
petrol-based
memorial
products.
meeting.
Thank you.